Welcome to the Stories Told podcast. This is episode 69, the original Stranger Things. This is the Stories Told podcast. Two authors talking about stories in movies, TV, and of course, books.
I'm Michael Grayford. I write action-adventure stories in fantasy and sci-fi worlds, sometimes for younger readers and sometimes for adults. And I try to always inject at least a little bit of humor.
And I am author E.W. Barnes, and I write action-adventure, time travel novels, and space opera science fiction. Thousands of years, thousands of worlds. But be forewarned, beyond here, there will be spoilers. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's begin. Welcome back to the Stories Told podcast. I'm author E.W. Barnes, and with me is author Michael Grayford. And today we're climbing into the Wayback Machine and talking about the 1982 film E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. How are you doing today, Mike?
I am doing quite well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's hot. We're recording this
Yes.
in June on the west coast of the United States, and we're under what they were calling a heat dome, so it's supposed to be pretty bad. You stay cool where you are, and we're going to stay cool where we are.
Yeah, that's a good plan.
And what's new in your writing world?
Writing world. Let's see, I'm just continuing with editing the Deep Dark to beta. And I set up some ads for Zara on Amazon in different countries. See if I could get some attention there. And I have a promo coming up. So actually probably done by the time this airs for Zara one. That's it. Mostly just editing now still. How about you?
Okay.
What's going on in your writing world?
I am so close with Ecliptic. So I have one more chapter to do, and I've started writing that. And it's mostly already written scenes that I just need to weave together. And I usually, in this particular series, I am doing epilogues in every book. And so I've got the epilogue loosely framed out. I think there's a little bit more I want to do, but that will come as I write it. The epilogue involves a unique character that I'm not going to talk too much about because I would really like readers to sort of discover this character on their own. But this character has an entirely unique culture and world building that I have done for this character. So I love exploring that in my writing. You know, it's obviously not going to be a info dump, but I like exploring what I have created when I'm writing and revealing little bits and pieces of that. So that's always fun to write.
Cool.
The other
Almost
thing
done.
Yeah, I'm almost done. Well, and then the next thing I need to do are epigraphs. Do you know what epigraphs are?
No, I don't.
They're little segments of information that I put at the beginning of every chapter. And it gives me an opportunity to share with the reader part of that world building without putting it into the chapter as an info dump. So
Yeah, just like a little snippet.
Yeah, exactly. So as an example, in the first book in this series, my epigraphs were stuff like, this takes place millions of years in the future after the death of the planet. So there's a paragraph about when the sapient species of Earth left Earth and where they went. And then there's the next one is essentially like the personnel record for one of the characters that you're meeting, or just little things like that. Sometimes it's describing the equipment that they use, or sometimes it's like there's a one I did that's essentially like a law that was drafted by the government that oversees all this. So just little things like that. So
That's cool. I like that.
And it's just, to me, some people don't read them, and that's fine. I think it's for those who are interested, who want to learn a little bit more, dig a little deeper, it's there. And if you just want to keep going with the story, no worries, ignore the epigraph and keep going. But I think it's kind of fun, and it gives me an opportunity to kind of share the world building that I have created and the ideas that I have in place for this universe for those who are interested. So
I like that approach.
Yeah, and I have to do that. I have little notes about each chapter saying, okay, I want to talk about this one, talk about this one, talk about this one, talk about this. So then have to go back and fill all those in. And I've already started writing the next one in some fashion. I've got all kinds of notes in the third book because it's carrying on, the series. So I'm like jumping in, start here, what's going to happen here, what's going to happen here, etc. So
yeah, I do that.
It's almost ongoing. It's like I'll finish the book, but I'm not really finished because then I'm moving on to the next one. There's no real break.
Right.
So as a reminder to our listeners, you can read The Adventures of the Empyrean Guard, which is the series I was just discussing, and that is available in draft on Patreon as it is being written. So if you want to see that as it's coming along and see how changes occur as I develop the series, you can do that on Patreon. You can read Tales of Zara, which is Mike's series, that the first book of which is available on Amazon in both episodic format on Kindle Vella, as well as in ebook and paperback format. And there's a promotion going on with Zara, you said. And what is the nature of that promotion? Is that going to give people discounts?
Yeah. It's 99 cents for the ebook, and the paperback will be $10.99 on Amazon, and $15.99 I think elsewhere. You buy the paperback at Barnes and Noble or something like that. But that runs June 8th through the 14th. So I'm not sure if that will already be done by the time we release this podcast. But yeah, That's where it is.
Well, and if it is done by the time the podcast is released, we encourage our listeners to sign up for both of our newsletters, which is available on our websites, and the links are in the show notes. And then you'll get advance notice of these kinds of promotions, because I too have a promotion. The first in my time travel series will be available for free starting on the 18th of June. So that kind of information is available in our newsletters, a lot more timely than our podcast might be. And what interesting stories have you come across in television or books or movies?
Let's see. I finished the final season of Star Trek Discovery. So that wrapped up, and they are now done with Discovery. It seems like they're setting up a potential spin-off, or maybe they're going to connect some character or characters from Discovery into a different spin-off that they're planning. I just have that feeling. I don't know that for sure, but it seems like they're kind of setting things up to have another series with characters going in and out, maybe. Anyway, so that's what I was watching, and I think that's it. What have you been reading or watching lately?
That's pretty much it for me too. Finished up The Center Seat, that documentary about Star Trek.
Oh yeah.
I finished that up, and also finished watching Discovery. Trying to think, was there anything else? Oh, actually, this is not really sci-fi or fantasy based, but encountered a documentary about Hans Zimmer, the composer.
Yeah,
it's brilliant. It's great. You really, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's
okay, cool.
It's an amazing documentary. I mean, I deeply admire him as a composer, and after watching the documentary, I admire him as a human being, because you get to learn a little bit more about him. So
okay, cool. I'll check that out.
Yeah, and I think that's
what network or service is that on?
I think we found it on Netflix, and I think it was also available on Amazon through they've started doing all these platform sharing with other services. So if you sign up for Mac, you get and if you sign up, so this one I think was on BBC. I think this is a BBC production. So if you sign up for the BBC connection they've got, then you can see this one too. But if you've got Netflix, it was on Netflix. And if you type it in, Hans Zimmer, what is it? Hollywood Rebel. It was called Hans Zimmer Hollywood Rebel. If you type that in, it pops up in a bunch of different places. So it's widely distributed. So hopefully that means that you can find it on a service that you have.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Are you ready to talk about E.T.?
Yes, I am. Let's do it.
Today we're talking about the story told in the 1982 film E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial. And I'm going to read the plot summary that comes up when you type E.T. into Google. After a gentle alien becomes stranded on Earth, the being is discovered and befriended by a young boy named Elliot. Bringing the extraterrestrial into his suburban California house, Elliot introduces E.T., as the alien is dubbed, to his brother and his little sister Gertie, and the children decide to keep his existence secret. Soon, however, E.T. falls ill, resulting in government intervention and a dire situation for both Elliot and the alien. Did you like this movie?
Yeah, this is a movie I haven't seen since I was a kid. When it first came out in 1982, I really liked it when I first saw it. It was a huge success. And so I wanted to see it again to see, okay, let me revisit E.T. since I haven't seen it in 40 years or however long it's been. And it's an interesting movie looking back at it now, seeing how different things were back then in terms of like filmmaking and storytelling. It's kind of weird because it felt like a movie that was trying to be nostalgic about the 80s when obviously it was made in the 80s, but there are these pop culture references scattered throughout the movie about asteroids and space invaders, video games at the time, and kids playing Dungeons and Dragons and Tom and Jerry cartoons and Star Wars toys and speak and spells, all these like things that were around that seemed like they were forced into the movie, looking from the future into the past. But it was just Spielberg, using like the pop culture of the time, which is, I think, why a lot of his movies maybe have that nostalgia to them, because he was kind of immersed in it and he presented it to, his audience. So it was just interesting to see that. I wasn't expecting that. I didn't remember a lot of that stuff. But when you see something like Stranger Things, which is obviously trying to do that, and then you see E.T. and it's like they feel so similar in that way, it's really weird.
I have the exact same notes. Stranger Things really caught the feel.
Yeah. It's funny because it's like, that was just a movie then. We just grew up with that. It didn't feel like it was trying to do that at the time. It was just stuff that was around you. But if you want to see like a movie with early 80s feel to it, then E.T. is a good one. It's a very cute movie. It's clearly aimed at kids. I think it probably maybe still works better for kids than for adults, at least nowadays. I think the kind of stories that we're looking for are maybe a bit different. I do like that it presents a positive view of aliens rather than, aliens as invaders or destroyers, which is such a common thing now in books and comics and TV and movies. It's nice to see, a friendlier version, right? I love the fact that they called him E.T. It's like, what's your name? Alien. We're just going to call you Alien. That's basically what it is. They don't bother giving him a name. I thought that was funny. But it's a fun movie that has, warmth and positivity and good emotions. So I think there's a lot to like here. Overall, I felt it was a bit lacking for me from a storytelling perspective and from a pacing perspective, but we'll talk about that a bit when we get to things that could be improved. How was your visit in your travel through the Wayback Machine? What did you think about E.T.?
I was surprised how well it held up. I don't think I have watched it since my offspring was young. So it's been over a decade, probably more. And then between that watching and the original watching was probably a couple of decades. So, and I didn't remember a lot of the details, which was kind of nice. So it was like rediscovering those details. Yeah. But I thought it really actually held up well, all things considered. And one of the things that I noted was, right at the beginning, we don't start with the humans, we start with E.T., which suggests, theoretically, this is his story. And it's the title of the movie. So it's kind of like, when I saw that, I was like, okay, I'm going to try to look at this through the lens of E.T. as if he's the hero of the story as opposed to, say, Elliot. Even though we spend a lot more time with Elliot because Elliot is relatable as the human being. And I thought it was really quite brilliant that they made this very strange looking creature relatable from moment one. He's out there marveling at the beauty of creation on Earth. You know, the beautiful little trees that grow into these big trees, and he is marveling at this, which is something we can relate to. We recognize the beauty of great trees, and then peering out across the valley of lights and marveling at, you know, the spread of human beings and the civilization that has been created, and, you know, appreciating that as well, which I think many people can also relate to. So I thought that was really well done, how they started that off. And then, of course, we turned around and we connected with the human beings. And one of the things that surprised me, and yes, I had the same note about how Stranger Things really caught that feeling well. I mean, it was like, okay, you know, it's sort of like you could just see the parallels done so beautifully well. But they also did the kids so accurately. These kids were not... Sometimes when you watch kids in television shows or movies, they look like little actors. They behave like little actors. They feel like little actors, and they're just doing the part. These kids felt real. And the whole circumstance felt real. And you could see all of their needs from the get-go. Elliot wants to play Dungeons and Dragons with the big kids, and his older brother doesn't want his younger brother interfering with his bonding time with his fellow teenagers. And, you know, the kids all have a need because their family is fracturing because of their dad's leaving, and their mom is struggling because this is so new and she's trying to just keep things together. And, you know, Gertie's just trying to figure out what's going on. And those needs are all so well presented at the very beginning without a whole lot of spotlight on either one. It's just very organic and well done. I thought that was very impressive. And then the rest of the story is just fun. It was just sort of a fun little story. I thought the pacing was okay. You know, obviously there was some times where you're spending some time with the creature, getting to know it better, or spending some time with the special effects that they were, you know, crafting and working on. But it didn't take away from the story for me. As a matter of fact, I stayed with the story throughout and didn't feel... I was really expecting to be honest, to do some other things while I was watching. You know, I had things next to me that I was going to like work on while I was watching and saying, oh yeah, I remember that. And I didn't. I paid attention the whole time. And I was like, okay, it kept me going, which I really enjoyed. I also really liked, and this is kind of something that I was thinking of as I was watching this, there are a lot of movies that are sort of location oriented, and then they take the location and they craft a story that takes place in that location. Like stories that take place in New York City. New York City is this huge populated area that then you can sort of drill down and find little villages or little communities, etc., and you can center your story there. While it's still in the big universe of the big city, you've got your very intimate location for your stories. And we see lots of movies like that where you have just little intimate stories taking place in New York or some other large city. And then you might have stories that take place in small towns, right? And you have these little towns where everybody knows each other, and then you have your stories centered around that small town and using that as your environment. I may be wrong, but I don't think there was many stories told in the suburbs. I mean, you have I'm thinking like the Brady Bunch, that was kind of suburban. You know, and some other stories, but I think Spielberg took these sort of suburban tales and raised them up a level, to the same kind of level that you would see the New York stories or the small town stories. Does this make sense at all?
Yeah, no, I think that was one of the things that he really got quite well.
Yeah.
You see that in here, and you see it even in like Poltergeist, his horror movie, right? It just takes place in the suburbs.
Yes. Or you also saw it with what was his name that did like The Breakfast Club?
John Hughes.
John Hughes films. Those were very suburban oriented films.
Yes, yeah.
And so this is, to me, that sort of like took the genre and sort of raised it up in a way that hadn't been done before. Now I could be wrong because I haven't done a full review or analysis or anything. But that was just sort of the thing I was thinking as I was watching this was, you know, tales of the suburbs is what this looked like and what you could see from Spielberg.
Almost like suburban culture around that time. Maybe because Los Angeles was expanding, right? And more people were living in the suburbs around the big city. And that was something that, you know, the filmmakers themselves were experiencing.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But it was just a thought that I had. And I did do a little research. That house that they filmed in was actually a brand new home in a brand new subdivision that had just been built. The film
Yeah.
crew were the first occupiers of that home.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to live in Simi Valley, which is another suburb outside of LA, and it was the same thing there when he filmed Poltergeist. It's the same thing. They were building a new subdivision, and they were filming in one of the houses. So when I was watching ET, I was like, "Oh, it's just like they did over there." That must have been
Yeah.
his thing at that time.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense because you have a whole neighborhood, but you don't have to worry about
Yeah,
kicking anybody out of their house or,
exactly.
interfering with anybody else. I think it's kind of brilliant, a brilliant idea. And something that, like you
Yeah,
just
it is.
said, was an available avenue to do the film at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned a few things that I was also thinking as I was watching it, and I didn't think to write down the notes, but I think they're important. I agree that the opening is very cool. It's like we see the aliens right from the start. Like this movie's about aliens, and it's not like it's some mystery. It's like, oh, here the aliens are landing. They're obviously landing on Earth. There's a city down there on the in the valley, and we just get right into it. I love that. Good approach and kind of a surprising one. I didn't remember that from the movie. And then also, yeah, the kids were fantastic. Like watching them in the living room playing games, it just felt so real. It felt like being there at that time. And like the conversations were almost like things that I've taken part of, back in the day. It's just he's so good at just capturing that moment is incredible. And yeah, I thought a couple other things I forgot to mention. I thought that ET, his progressively getting more and more sick and then dying. I thought that felt very real. He did a
Yeah.
really good job with that, and it felt traumatic when he dies. You're like, oh my gosh, he's dead, right? And I think they set that up well, and they set up well the connection between him and Elliot early
Yeah.
on in the movie, and then you see that develop more as the story goes on. Obviously, I thought that was nice, and this has nothing to do with writing, just a filmmaking thing. I thought was funny because living in Southern California, you see these things all the time. It's like they're clearly in a Southern California neighborhood, right? In what we call the Valley here. And then all of a sudden they're in the redwoods riding their bikes through these big
Right.
trees,
Exactly. So,
which
yeah.
is like way north in the state. So I thought that was funny.
Note to listeners, there are no big redwoods outside of suburbs in Los Angeles.
No. And the other thing that was funny is they were in the very beginning when Elliot is, he hears something outside and he goes outside. It's like he's walking through a cornfield or something next to his house.
Yes.
Like where is this taking place? This is
Yeah.
like so weird because that also does not exist here.
And I wanted actually to follow up on what you just said about the connection between E.T. and Elliot, because that could have been kind of creepy. That could have been
Yeah.
scary. And they actually
Right.
handled it with humor. And I thought that was really incredibly well done. The E.T. accidentally getting drunk and then E.T. watching a scene from a movie, which if you don't know already, that movie is The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. It's a fun movie. It's a lot of fun. So it's just, but they handled it with humor so that it didn't seem frightening, like, this child was being taken over by, an extraterrestrial. It was just funny. And I thought that was really well done. You can see the connection and still have it feel okay.
There was one question I had with that. It seemed like towards the end, when ET was getting sick and dying, it seemed like ET was sort of connected to Elliot and almost using his life force to sustain him or something. And then there was a moment where he kind of separated himself and is like, okay, you live your life and I'm just going to die here. That's what it felt like, but I don't know if that was what they were going for. Did you have a sense of that at all?
No, I didn't. I got more just the sense that he was connected to Elliot because he was lonely. And that's how his species might have, functioned, this interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And that
I think it makes more sense in the story.
But then he realized that the connection was causing Elliot problems, and so he disconnected to save his friend. That's kind of what I got.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because there certainly was nothing explicit
Yeah,
about
no,
what
there
I
was
was
not.
feeling. It was just, it seemed like there was a moment where he intentionally separated that link. But you're right, it was probably just because, hey, we have this connection, but we can't because I'm going to take you down with me if we do.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of the
Okay, yeah,
feeling
that
I
makes
got.
sense. Yeah, no, I think you're right.
So let's talk about what we might have changed in this story. What, if anything, might you have changed? You already kind of mentioned that you had some thoughts, so I'm not going to pretend.
Yeah,
What would you
yeah, I
change?
think for me, I think it was a bit of a slow start once we get like we see the alien and then we see them playing and then it just kind of lingers for a while. Not lingers, but it's a very slow pace as they get to know each other and introduce the other family members, and then he goes to school. It just seemed kind of a little bit slower than it needed to be there. I would probably have pushed that along a little more quickly. I think this is part of being in the modern generation where we have stuff blasted at us so fast.
Yeah.
I think it's harder for me to appreciate movies that go a little slower, unfortunately. For the modern era, I would speed that up a bit. The other thing is I would make ET a bit sharper and more intelligent seeming from the start, because when you first see his interactions with Elliot and the family, he almost seems like a child, like them, in the way that he handles things. But then he builds a radio communications device with a fork and an umbrella, so he's he's obviously an educated being who knows enough to do something like that. And I just wish he'd been treated as a little bit smarter from the beginning and a little bit more savvy in terms of how to communicate with another species. I mean, they're out there
Yeah.
exploring the universe. I don't think that would have taken away the charm from the story at all. I guess it seemed like they kind of wanted him to feel a little childlike so that he had the connection with the other children, which
Yeah.
was fine. I wish he had shown a little bit more of what you would expect an explorer on another planet to act like.
Yeah.
And some of this comes from, I think it was in stark contrast to Project Hail Mary, which we recently read, right? Where
Yes.
both of those two main characters are very sharp and they learn to communicate with each other very quickly. And you would expect something more like that from an interstellar traveler, right? Whereas here he just kind of like, he runs away, bumbles around, and it's fun and it's cute, but I just would have liked a little bit more to see like, okay, this is a smart being here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just missing that a little bit. And I know it kind of kills the setup for the movie, but it bugged me that the aliens just flew off and they either didn't realize that one of their own was missing or they just gave him up for dead. I know this is like, that's sort of the setup for the whole movie, but if they could have at least shown them like come back and try to look for him and like, oh, I guess he's just gone and leave or something. That was just another thing that stood out to me. Again, modern sensibilities, perhaps. It just seemed like, hey, they just abandoned poor ET on this planet, and they didn't even come back to check on him. So that was another weird thing. Yeah, and overall, I think I wanted just a little bit quicker plot and more narrative drive. I know it's not that kind of movie, and that's fine. Like I said, it probably still works for kids. Or obviously, I mean, you really liked it. I will say this: I think it still holds up well as a story. It doesn't feel cheesy. The alien is done very well. I think it has a lot of good elements. I just would want maybe a little bit tighter, a little bit quicker paced, and fix a couple of those things that I mentioned. Is there anything that you would improve in ET?
Well, yes, it's funny because when you said about, they left him behind, my question was, if they left him behind, why did they leave him behind? And then why did they come back? Because that was what I thought was strange. They had to leave because, the guys with the flashlights were coming. Then how could they come back and get him? That's what I thought was a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah.
And I think if ET had said something about, and he could have somehow communicated, maybe they thought that he wanted to stay behind and study the trees more, and they would come back when he called. Or I don't know. Or then why did he need to build the transmitter? He should have had something. It was just that particular piece of it. If it was so important to leave that they had to leave him behind, how could they then come back when he called? That was a slight disconnect. I don't think it's enough to really damage the story, but it was something I made note of this time.
Can I hop back in for a second?
Yes.
You made me think of something else. Yeah, the other thing is at the very end, I was thinking like, so here's this alien species and there's no attempt at like first contact discussions, communications. Hey, let's talk about, the universe and technology and worldviews and nothing. It's just like, they're flying off again.
Yeah. Now, I will say this. I actually read the novelization when this first came out. And the way that they were portrayed in the novel was that they were just botanists. That was it. They were just botanists. So they weren't like tasked with diplomatic or even had the diplomatic skills. They were just collecting samples. So it was a very simple sort of routine expedition, as I recall from reading it, decades ago. So
yeah, well, they do set that up in the movie as well. You see, like as they're going around on the ship, there's little like plant-like things there, and then his connection with the flowers and stuff like that throughout the movie. And then I think at the end he takes a pot with him, right, or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, okay, that makes more sense.
So some other thoughts that I had was I had another thought that was very similar to yours in that it was through sort of my modern storytelling lens that I didn't have at the time. And that is, I wish there were more girls. It would have been nice to have some girls in the Dungeons and Dragons group hanging out. And now that wasn't how these stories were told back then. And I get that. But through my sort of current lens, that's something that I missed was, having a little bit more, besides Mom and Gertie, an adult and a 4-year-old, there's no other female presence in the story. Not a big deal. Doesn't really take away from it too much. That's not how stories were told back then. But now I would like to have seen that if I were to do it now.
Yeah, that's true. I think it was probably accurate to what was back then, at least.
Absolutely.
In my experience of playing Dungeons and Dragons and video games, it was definitely just other boys.
Yeah. And the other thing I would have liked to have seen is something that we've talked about before, which is to have a little bit of a wrap up after the big climactic scene or the big end scene, just a little bit of what happens after kind of things. We've talked about this before because the story essentially ends when the aliens fly off. And I would have loved to have seen, there's a little bit of indication that Mom and the guy with the keys were going to connect. He seemed to be very empathetic and supportive of her. And so I would have liked to have seen, something along those lines of seeing how that was going to play out. And like, for example, then Elliot being allowed to play Dungeons and Dragons with the big kids after this. What changed for these folks after this experience? Yeah. I would have liked to have seen that.
That's a great note. I thought it was interesting, the guy who apparently was just called Keys in the script. Like, we kept seeing these keys. I'm like, what do the keys have to do with anything? There must be some meaning here, some kind of symbolism or something that I'm not getting. But, obviously it was to show us who that character is later. We know, okay, it's that guy with the keys, but they just kept showing it. It was really weird. I don't know why he did that. Do you have any insight into whether there was any symbolism there or meaning behind that?
The only thing that I think that was really done is this was a very sort of, I actually kind of like this, the way they did that. They made the bad guys faceless for most of the movie.
Right.
They were just silhouettes. And then the guy with the keys made him stand out as, a jingling silhouette. But other than that, you didn't know until you got to where they captured them, and then we started seeing faces. And even at the very beginning when they were captured, when the government agents moved in, those guys were all still in hazmat. So you still didn't see much in the way of faces.
Yeah,
and so it wasn't until you really drill down and you've got your doctors and then you've got this guy who's running this thing, I guess, and you've got your supervisors and everything, then you start to see faces. So and I thought that was well done to sort of keep them faceless and scary.
Yeah, I agree. I like that.
Yeah. But I have no idea what the keys symbolism was.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll look that up
usually
afterwards.
Back in those days, somebody with keys had authority because they had access to things.
Right. Yeah.
Keys
Yeah, that's
unlock
true.
things. Sorry, that's
Yes.
my little pirates reference for the day.
Great. Yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe it was that. Another thing I thought that kind of stood out to me now. Remember after George Lucas changed some stuff in Star Wars, and then Spielberg went back to this movie, E.T., and changed it so when the people are chasing after the kids, he replaced their guns with walkie-talkies or something like that. Do you remember that?
No, and no, they were clearly guns.
Yeah, well, now he changed it back
Oh, okay.
because he was like, well, yeah, I shouldn't edit this stuff. You know, everyone was
Yeah.
complaining, and he's like, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't be changing this. But with them being guns, I was like, the mom's like, what are you doing? They're kids. And I'm like, yeah, what are you doing? Like, all of you have guns out?
Yeah.
And there's just these little kids with a dead alien? Like, why do you have your guns ready to go? Like, that did strike me as a little odd.
And I think that was also very reflective of the time.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah. So what would you say is a theme of E.T. the Extraterrestrial? Did you pull any themes from this?
Yeah, this one was tricky for me. I mean, I think there's a lot going on here with family, like being connected, belonging, right? We see that with Elliot wanting to be part of the group in the beginning. I guess one thing that I would say, if I'm going to put it as a sentence, like a claim of truth, we're all capable of forming deep emotional bonds. In this case, exemplified by being able to do that with an alien, right? Someone not even of Earth. So that's the one thing that I took away. It feels a little light to me, so I'm hoping you have something more precise and accurate. What do you have?
Well, it's very similar. What I came out with was the strength of friendship, because it was the strength of Elliot and E.T.'s friendship that helped save E.T. It was the strength of, what's the brother's name? Michael? Michael and his friends who helped save them, as they all came racing to the rescue on their bikes. So the strength of that friendship that was in play. And even the very small hints of this guy with keys and the mom, he was offering her friendship in a very difficult time. And that was giving her strength. So there was these different layers of friendship that we were examining. And Elliot was developing new friendships with Michael's friends as this was moving forward. So that's what I pulled from this, the strength of friendship.
Okay, yeah, it is very similar. Another thought I had on the Keys character, the way they're setting him up from the very beginning, it seemed like, okay, this is the bad guy, right? He's hunting down the ET, but then when you meet him, it's like, oh, this guy's not so bad.
Yes,
He's, he wanted this unique experience, right? He was been waiting to encounter an alien civilization, something like that. He totally empathizes with Elliot and gives him the time he needs to be with ET. Like he's a good guy, actually. So I thought that was cool. I like the twist that he did there.
Yeah, exactly. So with that in mind, who was the villain? What was the villain? The antagonist, the bad guy?
That's a good question. Even the people who came, right? The people in the NASA astronaut suit, for some reason, I'm not sure what that was about, but I guess, NASA's has, their space, so they have some vested interest in this. They show up, and like the CDC people, but they all seem cool. They they're trying to save the alien. I don't think they're my memory of it from when I was younger was like, okay, these are the bad guys, right? They're trying to prevent them from helping ET, but they're not. I mean, they didn't know that ET came back to life. Sure, they're probably trying to study him. Maybe they'll do something, but I doubt they're just going to immediately dissect them. Maybe that was a more common trope back in the day. I think it would probably be more like, hey, let's establish communications, right? Like that seems like that would be something that they would do. So maybe I'm just looking at that from a modern lens, but it's hard to see them as the bad guy now as an adult in today's world, though maybe that was what they were going for back then. Let me try to think of, okay, looking at it from today's perspective, I guess it's more just the situation. If I had to pin it on a person or a group, it would have to be them. It would have to be, the people who come and they take over the house and basically they're taking away the freedom of, the people who are trying to deal with the situation, Elliot and his family. So I guess I would still say they are the antagonist of the story, but it's very loose.
I was feeling the same thing. I kind of, as I asked that question, the thing that popped into my head was the antagonist of the story is the sort of just the monolith of the government entity that was going to step on these people in order to get to ET. And yeah, they may be nice about it, but that wasn't going to stop them from taking him.
Right, yeah. If you look at what the objective of the protagonist is, right? It becomes get ET home, right? He wants to phone home, we're going to bring his people back, and these people are in the way of that, right? They don't want that. Yep. So, exactly. So I guess that makes sense.
So, as a writer, what do you take away from ET, the Extra-Terrestrial?
I think for me, this movie, this story really relies on the characters caring for each other. I mean, that's sort of the theme in the message, right? That's what we came up with, and I think without that, it's pretty light, right? It would have to be a different story. So I think having characters that really care for each other goes a long way, and it's the focus of this movie. Plot wise, this movie is very loose. There's not a lot of stuff that happens. There's not a lot of twists that are going on. It's a fairly straightforward movie, fairly straightforward story, but it works because we get invested in the characters and we get invested in the relationships, especially the relationship between Elliot and E.T. So that's my takeaway.
My takeaway are a couple of things we've already talked about. You didn't actually use this word, but you definitely referenced this when you were talking about what you liked about it, and that is it has heart. And we like stories with heart. So I took the heart from that. It's another reminder to make sure that I craft stories with heart because I enjoy that. I also, like we've talked about previously, this was a team collaborative effort, not an individual. And it's funny because that's what I was thinking when you were saying about how modern takes on extraterrestrials are going to be about attacking and trying to destroy us. And then usually there's just this one person who is responsible, one hero responsible for saving the world in sort of modern tellings of extraterrestrial encounters. And this, I enjoyed this because it was a sort of team. We had Elliot as the team leader, but he was definitely relying on his brother, his sister, and then later his brother's friends to help get ET home. And then the other thing I took from it was just like looking for unusual settings and venues, like we talked about, where you might have stories taking place in a big city or stories taking place in a small town or stories taking place in the suburbs. How can you take a look at the world, see how things have changed, and then put your story in a new place that might not have been common, from previously. Yeah.
I like that. I like those. You mentioned a really good one. Well, all those are really good.
Thank you.
One that I particularly like. The funny thing, you mentioned heart. I was actually going to use that word. I'm like, do I overuse that?
Well, no.
but you're right. I mean, that was like the core of this story, I think, is the heart, right? And the T1. That's something I've been trying to put in all of my stories. I like having a setup where multiple characters have to come together in the climax to deal with whatever the situation is. I really like that kind of setup and those kind of stories. And though it doesn't smack you over the head in this movie, but you're right, it's definitely there. They needed the group of them to pull this off and save ET. I also like the fact that it's just ET, right? The extraterrestrials, just one of them. It's not a group or a race or it's just we're focusing this to being a very small, tight story on primarily these two characters, Elliot and ET, and making it tight. So I like that too.
Thank you for joining us as we talked about the story told in ET. A big thank you to our Patreon supporters and all our subscribers. We're so grateful for your support and your encouragement. The Stories Told podcast is available on multiple podcast platforms, and we thank you for liking and subscribing or following, depending on where you're listening. It may not be a big deal to you, but it means a lot to us. If you have a favorite book, movie, or TV series you'd like to suggest for the podcast, leave a comment on the YouTube channel, and that link is in the show notes. You can find Michael Grayford at michaelgrayford.com and E.W. Barnes at 1000years.com, and those links are also in the show notes. Join us next time as we discuss the story told in the series Andor. Thanks so much, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks. It was nice to take a trip in the Wayback Machine.
It was indeed. And we'll see you next time on the Stories Told podcast.